parts of what's now basically on the dividing line between India and Pakistan and northwestern South Asia. It was a language of learning and a language of a high religious ceremonial cult. But what I'm interested in talking about today is is the later history, what happened to it in time. It went from being a language of a small, like I say, of a very, very small and, if you like, elite group of religious professionals to being, in fact, a globalized language, a language that looked upon the entire world as its own. It moved from, so the story begins in about 150 AD with a man called Rudradaman, a king ruling in what's now Gujarat. When he first set up on a large piece of stone in his kingdom an inscription celebrating himself and the reconstruction of a dam that he had overseen in Sanskrit for the first time, taking this language out of its sacerdotal domain and into the public life. Within several centuries' time, it became, with remarkable speed for the ancient world, it became a language that had a cultural life extending from Afghanistan, subject of a forthcoming exhibit at the British Museum, from Afghanistan in the northwest to Java in the east, from Dunhuang in China in the north, and to Sri Lanka in the south. It was, and I can't emphasize this enough, it was a demanding subject. It was, I've been studying Sanskrit for a better part of my life, for 15 years now. I'm still struck with a kind of, nothing less than a kind of odd, with a kind of awe at the level of cultivation that its mastery requires. And this is something that people chose to do throughout the planet, through a very meaningful chunk of the planet for a very long time, over a millennium. It was, and here I'm quoting the words of my teacher, it was a form of non-coercive cosmopolitanism. It was a language that extended throughout the world, not tied to an ethnic identity like in the Han Chinese world, not tied to a political formation like in the Latinate world, not tied to a religious identity like the historical careers of Latin and of Arabic, but rather by a kind of attachment to a common intellectual cultivation, a common pursuit of language. Western European scholarship, which has been invested in Sanskrit for now over 200 years, originally missed this point, missed it rather badly, in fact. In part, this had to do with the fetish for origins that early Western scholarship approaches. They were really interested in where my story began and not where my story ends up today. But still, there's an upshot to this. When in the West, people first encountered the sheer cultivation of the idea of language that we saw in the Sanskritic world, it blew their minds, quite literally. We wouldn't have anything resembling the modern science of linguistics if it wasn't for this formative encounter with this with the deep history of this knowledge form. So like I said, I've sketched in a big picture of how Sanskrit worked, but why was it important? Why did people find it interesting? I don't want to disparage or take away from the idea of the profound religious commitments that have seen themselves given expression through Sanskrit. The world religion of Buddhism, the pan-South Asian religion and Southeast Asian religion of Hinduism, the Indian religion of Jainism. All of these were religious traditions that were deeply imbricated in the use and cultivation of this language. What I'd rather look at is something maybe in more what we might call the secular world. What I want to look at is a piece of poetry. I'm going to read it out to you and explain a bit about it, and explain about how people thought about it and how it was read. This is from a collection of very racy erotic poems. It's one of the opening verses. It's a prayer, although a very strange kind of prayer. I'll read it out for you before telling you a bit about it. It reads in the original. Chipto hastavalaknaha prasabama vihatopi adadanong shukamtam grihnan ke sheshwapastas tarananipatito yekshita sambhamerna alingin yovadhutas tripura yuvati pi sasru netrotpalapi kami varjra parada sadahatu shambabo vach sharagnihi.
Is there a student protest there?
Beg your pardon?
Is there a student protest
there? Yeah, it's all over the country. It's a national day of action.
I'm a lecturer.
You're a lecturer? What does knowledge is no press?
Huh? Knowledge doesn't mean that it's precious? Priceless? Beg your pardon?
Therefore, it has no price.
I'm going to go back to my lecture. Is that okay, guys? We can talk afterwards.
Where are you protesting in general?
I'm not protesting here. I'm giving a lecture, man.
That's cool. What are you lecturing?
Huh? I'm lecturing in Sanskrit.
Sorry, what?
Why don't you listen? Happy to tell you about it. Sanskrit. Okay, this verse, like I said, is the second of a series of 3 opening verses to a collection of erotic poetry. It was originally probably written by a man named Bana, who might be one of the greatest literary authors of all time. It begins. So, as I said, it's a prayer, but a very odd kind of prayer. I'm going to give a translation and try to actually delay what the verse itself does, because it delays giving up its key till the very end. But I might have to be a little bit fuzzy with the way I play with the language at first. So, kshipto hastava lagnaha, though thrown away, clinging to the hands. Prasabama bihatopi adadan on shukam tam, grievously struck at, all the same, grasping at the edge of the garment, seizing the hair, only to be thrown away, thrown at the feet, is not paid any attention to, in confusion, trying to embrace, shaken off by those women of the triple city, their lotus-like eyes filled with tears, like a lover recently committed a wrong. May the fire arrow of Shiva burn away all of your sins. Now, like I said, this verse plays on a certain... We have to unpack a bit about what's going on here before we can begin to talk about how it works as a piece of language. Once, we're told, the anti-gods, the enemies of the gods, became so powerful and overweening that they took their great triple level city to careen around the heavens like a UFO. The gods, in their panic, went to the great god Shiva and asked him to solve the problem for him. He, taking up a single great flaming arrow, shot it at the triple city and burnt it to ashes. This is the sort of mythic background knowledge of this. At the same time, there's again a set of conventions that have to do with the way that lovers interacted in ancient India, and with the fact that almost invariably the man would inevitably cheat on the woman. And then there are these lengthy scenes of reconciliation, of begging for forgiveness, of throwing himself at her feet, of kissing her garment, of trying to steal one last kiss while she tries to get away from him. The poet brings these two together in a kind of strange mix. Like I said, Kshipto hastava lagnaha, though thrown away, it seizes at the garment. All of these describing both our lover lately done wrong and Shiva's flaming arrow. This verse had been read by by a few very, very brilliant people, very, very brilliant men, one living in the 9th century in Kashmir named Anandavardhana, probably one of the greatest literary critics the world has ever known, and by another, a king, as it happens, a man called Arjuna-Varmadeva, living several centuries later in what's now central India. It's the latter, Arjuna-Varmadeva's comments that I just want to briefly explain. He sees this as an unusual and kind of uncomfortable mixture of a couple of different registers of language. On the one hand, we have, of course, what the verse purports to be about, the celebration of the power of the great god Shiva, and how he can possibly burn away all of our sins through the fire of his arrow. At the same time, we have our second like a series of overlapping photographs. We have this image of a lover throwing himself at the feet of his beloved that he's wronged, trying to reconcile, trying to get her back. And at the same time, and then finally, we have in our verse, we have in the climax of the verse about the women of the triple city as they're bursting into flames and their final death throes, a set of pathetic or even tragic undertones. Our literary critic, Arjuna-Varmadeva, our royal critic, if you will, takes great pains to try to pick this apart one thread at a time. How is it that this works, and how is it that it isn't a kind of collision of radically incommensurable things? Should we celebrate the love of God when God is at his most cruel? Should we somehow equate the power of the Almighty with the depredations of a cheating lover? very, very slowly and carefully, he picks this apart word by word, telling us how it works, how to describe how the woman doesn't look at her lover in her agitation, in the same way describing the agitated terrors of the women of the Triple City as their city burns to ashes all around them, or how the flames lick up and seem to embrace them. Finally, coming to a conclusion that we do see some sort of a strange overlapping of the emotional effect of the verse, one that actually, and despite all of our, despite maybe our initial sense of it, actually works in a kind of coherent, collective way. The power of the power of the God actually being underscored by the recent fumbling about of the lover, trying to actually get back his trying to get back the attentions of his lost beloved. So what we see here is the way that the Sanskrit Alankarikas or rhetoricians or literary critics would describe this is rasa, the flavor of the verse. And as they read through it carefully, inch by inch, syllable by syllable, they try to extract every single drop of what they describe as the verse's juice or rasa, flavor. This way of looking at a verbal artifact is something that can actually communicate to us. It can communicate above and beyond the way that regular language can, the way that poetry works, is one of the key contributions, I think, to world civilization that we see in Sanskrit literature, indeed in Sanskrit culture as a whole. And we see this as a sort of single element of the larger cultivation and fascination with language. Probably a lot of you know the name, journalist and sort of gadfly Christopher Hitchens. He's a man I don't agree with a great deal at the time, but when I was putting together my thoughts about this last night, I came across my copy of his book Letters to a Young Contrarian. A sort of mantra, to use a good Sanskrit word, that he comes back to over and over again is always look to the language. He's not the only person to observe this by any means, but he captures, I think, in that nice in that expression something of what I want to try to talk about Sanskrit, and about really what I think a 21st century humanities can and should be. Over and against Hitchens' motto, always look to the language, I'd like to put the motto of my own place of work, the School of Oriental and African Studies, right around the corner. Knowledge is power. For all of the slightly authoritarian and creepy overtones of that, it was originally thought of by Francis Bacon, who was thinking of it quite literally in a kind of brute sense of knowledge being power. What I want to bring these two ideas together, of knowledge and power, knowledge being power, and of the importance of language to our lives. Just as a final point, what the cultivation of Sanskrit does, like few other subjects, I think, is to remind us of a fundamental fact of our common humanity, which is that we are languaged beings. This is not something we think about all the time. It's something you can't help but think about, I think, as a student of, or a reader of, or indeed a writer of Sanskrit. A polity that is somehow alienated from the fact of being languaged, from the fact that somehow fundamental to our nature as social human beings is the common shared fact of language, is something that is a world that's both can be very easily misled, and is a world that can be very, as I said before, has lost in some small measure some part of its common humanity. Part of the vast history of humankind has been about the cultivation of language above all else. If we forget about being languaged, I think we forget ourselves. And I don't think that Sanskrit has a monopoly on this. I don't think that Sanskrit has a monopoly on the truth of language being. Still, I think that my subject and those of many of my colleagues at a school where I'm very, very proud to work gives us some insight into how we can profoundly try to recover this in the 21st century. And it gives us and proves us a model of how we might better know ourselves and know the world around us. Thank you very much for your time. Hope you all have a good day.
Thank you.